Hello, this is Pastor Don Long, and here you are in our Grafted In broadcast for this week as we, week after week, consider a variety of topics around what it means as Christians to be grafted into the root of Israel. We take advantage of looking at what's in the Bible, looking at our Jewish roots, looking at the festivals of God, but also looking at the events of the world, because the Bible speaks a lot about what has transpired in the world in the past, what is going on right now, and significantly what's going to take place in the future. Here we are in what I call Freedom Month. When we celebrate the 4th of July, you'll be watching this broadcast, I believe, on the 4th of July. But as we talk about the freedom that God desires for man, I think there's no more vital time in American history for us to begin to understand what God's plan is. God's plan was always that His people be free. But it's freedom to do something, it's freedom to be, as opposed to freedom from things. If we go back to the book of Exodus, in chapter 5, we read the story of Moses coming to Pharaoh. You will remember that Moshe had that encounter with a burning bush that was not consumed in the desert. And he had a God encounter at which God said, I've appointed you for this time and this season to go forth and deliver my people as I had promised. For Yahweh had said that after 400 years in Egypt, His people would come and come into the promised land which God decreed and declared was theirs. That declaration has never been changed. And to this day, according to God's word, all of Israel belongs to the Jewish nation, all of it. And you and I have been grafted into the root of Jesse. We've been grafted into the Jewish people, and therefore that is our nation as well. And so Moshe comes to deliver the people, and he comes to Pharaoh in chapter 5, verse 1. It says, afterwards Moshe and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what Yahweh, the Elohim, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh said, who is Yahweh that I should obey Him and let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go. And so from that moment on, there is the contest of those who are seeking freedom to follow God, to be what God calls them to be, and the oppression of tyranny that comes to control their lives and dictate to their lives and, in fact, keep them enslaved. Slavery is an interesting thing, because when we think of slavery, we think that people are enslaved with harsh taskmasters who beat them, who hang them, who abuse them. And certainly that is the extreme of slavery. But you can find slavery is very prevalent in Islamic countries even to this day, but it's a slavery of person ownership. It is a slavery of men domineering and controlling and owning women as property. Women have very little rights, if any. For example, in Saudi Arabia, the Quran tells men that they should beat their wives. So obviously a woman has no right if her husband disagrees and will beat her. In fact, under Sharia law, that the testimony of a woman doesn't carry the same weight as a testimony of a man. So there is a slavery that you might not recognize, where you could walk into a society and people seem to be going about their business and doing their shopping and so on and so forth, and yet in fact those women are not free. There is that kind of ownership slavery. And Moses came to set his people free, and in that conflict, Yahweh sided, of course, with His people. You know about the 10 plagues, you know what happened to Egypt, and finally Pharaoh, realizing that the cost of keeping the Israelites in slavery was going to be more than his nation could bear. In fact, his nation would end up being destroyed if in fact he did not let God's people go. Let them go, and the rest is the history of the freedom of God's people. That message of freedom was picked up nearly 2,000 years later by Yeshua. And Yeshua comes on the scene as a teaching rabbi, teaching the people the will of God. And in John chapter 8, verse 36, Yeshua says that if the Son makes you free, then you shall be free indeed. So he carries forward that message of freedom. The people around him, of course, react and say, we're no man's slave. How can you call us freedom? Call us, that we're not free. How can you say we're not free? Because we're not slaves to any man. Very interesting comment, because at that time, Rome was in control of the country. It was occupied, not like people say the West Bank is occupied by Israel today. It is not. It is possessed. It is their land. But Rome occupied the land. And here they're saying we're not any man's slave, but a Roman soldier could come at any moment and say, hey, you carry my bag 1 mile. And you have no choice. You're going to have to carry that man's bag, because whatever the Roman centurion ordered was exactly what you had to do. Rome ruled with an iron fist, but their image was, well, we're no man's slave. But Yeshua was addressing the fact that they had become in bondage to the traditions of men. Not in bondage to Torah, but in bondage to the traditions of men that went beyond Torah, that in fact dismissed Torah, set it aside, and we've talked about that many times on this broadcast, where in addition to what God said, the rabbis added all kinds of interpretations and thus bound men by religious traditions as to what could and couldn't be done according to men, not according to God. And Yeshua came to proclaim that freedom. When he began his ministry, he said, I've come to declare healing to those who are sick, to set the captive free. And again, you might think, well, then Yeshua came to have a freedom march and to get all the political prisoners out of the jails in Jerusalem. That's not the case. He came to set prisoners free, meaning anything that imprisons you. You could be imprisoned by drug addiction. Then those drugs, in fact, have you encapsulated. They've got you captured. You're a slavery to the drug. You can be in slavery to legal drugs and pain medication that's even being prescribed to you, but now you're bound by it. And Yeshua came to say the Father's goal, Abba's goal, Yahweh's goal, is that you and I be able to live a life that's free from things that bind us, that are addictive to us, that control and manipulate our life, but never proclaim that you and I should be free from the laws of God. You see, the laws of God have always been laws that men of faith saw supersede the laws of men, and in fact those laws of God are in place whether or not you agree with them. In nature we know that's true, because the law of gravity works. That's why you don't fly off the planet. You better be glad the law of gravity works. And then there's another law called the law of lift. And the law of lift, when properly applied, will always overcome the law of gravity, which means you can have a controlled flight from one country to another. And you get on the airplane, and because we understand the laws of lift, we can overcome the law of gravity and get from point A to point B. Those are laws. They do not change. Whether you agree with them or not, whether you think that is right or not, is totally immaterial, because those are laws that Yahweh put in place when he created this universe. And from an understanding of the law, then we're truly free. You see, now I'm free to be able to travel to Israel. I'm free to be able to go to Europe. I'm free to be able to go to India. I'm free to be able to take trips, because I have the freedom to get on a plane and fly free from the confines of gravity, which would say the only way I can get there is to walk or go by boat or something like that. So the law is not there to limit me, but the law is designed that with an understanding of the law and an honoring of the law and a walking out of the law, then I have true freedom. And so here we are in what I'm calling Freedom Month. We're celebrating the 4th of July. And what's the 4th of July all about? Well, people will say the 4th of July is about America's independence. We established a Constitution. We declared the Declaration of Independence. But what was the Declaration of Independence all about? It was freedom from tyranny. Freedom from tyranny. You know, the first church that I served here in Massachusetts was in Essex. It was the first Congregational Church of Essex, Massachusetts. And the first pastor there was Reverend John Wise. And you can Google John Wise and you'll find some amazing things about him. In fact, John Wise, as all of the Puritan pastors in those days, were highly involved in the revolutionary movement. They did not believe that in separation of church and state. The Constitution doesn't even use the phrase separation of church and state. What the Constitution says, the state needs to stay out of the affairs of the church, but it never said the church should stay out of the affairs of the state. And our early founding forefathers and our early Puritan preachers here in Massachusetts Bay Colony clearly understood that because the gospel, because the Bible is about freedom, then they had to be politically involved in the affairs of the colonies and with England to ensure that God's freedom is maintained over against the tyranny and oppression of either the king or Parliament. So John Wise was, for example, the first one known to have used the phrase that taxation without representation is unjust. You can't tax us unless we are a part of the process that determines that taxation. And if as British citizens here in the Commonwealth, in the colonies, you've removed from us our voice over matters of taxation, then that's tyranny, that's injustice. And the Christian thing to do is to stand up against it. If you were to have removed Christianity from the colonies, there would have been no revolution. It was, in fact, the saying of the British leadership that what carried the American Revolution was what they termed the black-robed regiments. And the black-robe regiments were the preachers who always preached in black preaching garb, black preaching robes. And those in leadership in England knew that what was fueling the drive for independence, what was fueling the movement for freedom, was those black-robed preachers who were instilling in their people God's desire to keep us free from slavery. And so Paul picks up this theme in Galatians 5:1, where he says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." I can almost hear in my mind Pastor John Wise in Essex preaching from Galatians 5:1 and telling his congregation, you need to stand free in the freedom that you have because you're a believer, because Christ set you free, and no king and no parliament can take that away, but you've got to stand firm because the king will send his soldiers. He'll try to make sure you obey his laws, which are unjust and unfair. I can just hear the very atmosphere around me reverberating with those patriotic calls to freedom from the early pastors in Massachusetts Bay Colony, reminding people that you got to stand firm, you got to hold on to your freedom. And so it is when we look at these men inspired by the scriptures and you know, the leaders in the revolution who were not clergy. You know, George Washington would be a good example. James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. These were not pastors, but they were very, very, very active churchmen, and they sat under the preaching of these fiery Black Road Regiment preachers. And so all of our early founding fathers knew that there are inalienable rights that had been given to us because the Creator Yahweh designed us to be free, and laws that take away our freedom, then we need to be prepared to stand firm for the freedom that is ours. John Adams wrote a very interesting statement. He said, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Ambition, revenge, gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as surely as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So John Adams is saying that freedom and constitutional freedom is only successful when it's based on, as he called it, morality and religion. And he, as well as dozens of other founding fathers, said that freedom becomes destructive. Freedom becomes self-centered. Freedom becomes a dictatorship when you divorce it from morality and religion. Freedom that says that we want to be free from the Constitution. Freedom that says we want to be free from the moral strictures of the Judeo-Christian religion. That kind of freedom leads to the dictatorship of the minority over the majority. Always has, always will. So as we come to this 4th of July and as we celebrate, the Declaration of Independence, the question we need to raise as Americans now is, are we independent, or has the very government we set up become the very thing our founding fathers feared? You see, they feared both the king and the court. They said that the king, if he's not checked, becomes a tyranny and gathers more power to himself. And the judicial system, if it's not checked by the people to make sure that it's serving the people, likewise will accrue power to itself. Our founding fathers had hoped that by setting up the Constitution, they were following a biblical pattern. When Moses delivered the people from Egypt and they went out to Mount Sinai, what happened? What was one of the first things in their birthing, if you will, as a nation? They had the miracles of God, and certainly as a nation, we can look back in our history and see the miracles that took place in the founding of the colonies. But as they got to Mount Sinai, God says, "You are now my people, and I'm your God, and so I'm going to give you commandments." He could have said it this way: I'm going to give you the rules by which, as a people, you can live freely. I'm going to give you Torah. And so the first 5 books of the Bible contain the rules for God's nation. In other words, that is the Constitution. The Constitution of God's people is the Torah. And all the commandments, this is what you need to do, and this is what you need not to do. And these are things that you have to follow my leadership in. Well, when our founding fathers got together in the Constitutional Convention, what were they interested in doing? Setting forth what are going to be the rules by which we as a people can function together. And they realized that there has to be a government, that they did not advocate for a theocracy like Israel was meant to be. They also did not want a king or a dictatorship. They wanted we the people in order to form a more perfect union. We the people are going to get together, and we need to realize that as we the people are going to move forward as a union, as we're going to move forward as a nation, we need rules that we agree to. Because if we don't agree to the rules, then it's every man doing what's right in his own eyes, and that always leads to the destruction of a society. And so they formed the Constitution and came up with that beautiful understanding that we're going to have 3 branches of government. It's astounding, by the way, that most graduates of high school in our nation right now, most of them, over 50% of them, can't name the 3 branches of government. We're in trouble when we, the people, do not understand our Constitution and therefore allow others to tell us what it means. The Constitution is not that long. You can sit down and read it in an hour. And yet we've lost a grasp for it. A biggest example, and I've mentioned this many times to me, is, the Constitution says there's a separation of church and state. And I've had teachers who say that, and I've said to them, it's not in the Constitution. They'll say, yes, it is. And I said, go read the Constitution and show me what article it says there will be a wall of separation between church and state. It is not there. That was in a letter that was written by George Washington dealing with a synagogue down in Rhode Island. It's talked about, but it's not in the Constitution. And if you read the understanding of the Constitution, as I said earlier, it is to say we will not have a government-appointed religion. In England, there was a government-appointed religion. The Anglican Church was the Church of England, and the Church of England therefore persecuted all other Christians who disagreed with the church. And they said, we're not going to have a government religion. They said that the government cannot dictate to the people what religious views they must have. I submit to you that the United States has a government religion, and it's taught in government religious schools called the public school system. Government religion believes in evolution, and therefore in government schools you're only allowed to teach evolution. You cannot say, by the way, it's a theory of evolution, because it's never been proved, and very well documented, known, prestigious evolutionists have admitted there is no evidence of evolution. Hawking said, there is no evidence for evolution. He said, but the alternative is unacceptable. In other words, what he's saying is, I can't accept creationism because creationism implies there is a God who's a creator, and that's unacceptable. You have a right to think that, but that's called a religious view. That's your religion. My religion is there's no God. My religion over here is there is a God. In Christian schools, you will be taught that there is a God. But by the way, you'll also be taught how others believe there is not a God. You'll be taught what atheism believes to contrast it with what we believe. But in government schools, you're never given the option. You're never given the option. You're only given one point of view. You're given the view of humanism. And all you need to do, by the way, is go back and read the Humanistic Manifesto, which is a religious document to take over education in America so that we can teach children our views. See, people think humanism is not religious. It most certainly is. It is a religious worldview. We believe there's no God. We believe in evolution. We believe in gay marriage. The whole thing that goes down there, that is a religious view. What we have now is a government mandating its views. You know, we're big into homeschooling in our congregation. All our children were homeschooled, and we have 9 children, and they've gone on to be successful in life, and yet there is a move among many in the education world to do away with homeschooling. And if you go to Sweden, you go to Germany, it's against the law to homeschool. Why is it that liberal societies that are, we're all for everybody, do whatever you want to, why are they so set against homeschooling? They're set against homeschooling because they, the state, can't control, therefore, what a child grows up believing. The gay and lesbian movement right now has an aggressive agenda to get the teaching of a gay lesbian lifestyle and transgender identities into kindergarten. And so now we're finding, little Johnny's coming home and saying to his mother, Mommy, am I a boy or a girl? That's not a natural question a kindergartner raises. That's a question that an adult put into their mind to think and create confusion. That's religious indoctrination. And so our founding fathers said that we have inalienable rights. We, the people, are going to form a nation, and we're going to ensure that our government, either in its executive branch, its legislative branch, or its judicial branch, maintain neutrality and not force religion upon us. And yet, through our courts, through our legislation, and through executive orders, that's exactly what's going on in this nation right now. Abortion is a religious issue. Now, if you believe this way, that's your right to believe it, but why do you shut down someone's belief to say something's different? I have a sign out in front of our church that has irritated a number of citizens in this community. We rotate the signs on our board, but once every so many months, the sign is out there for a week or two that says, marriage is between one man and one woman, and you know it. Now, that's my belief. I believe that God created all of us to know that. I believe humanity has known that since the dawn of history. It's not a confused issue in the mind of history. It's not a confused issue in the mind of the vast majority of Americans. Increasingly, younger people are changing their view, only again because of that religious indoctrination in school. But regardless of it, you believe that, that's fine. You have a right to believe that. But I have a right to believe what I say. And I've had comments from people who say, I have no right to put the sign out there. When did I lose my right to free speech? See, if we come to uniformity, then the question is, who's going to dictate what's right to believe? And so we have this whole political correctness move, which I believe would cause our forefathers to roll over in their graves and pick up arms again to defend themselves from a government dictating what they must believe. My goodness. James Madison wrote this: I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of freedoms of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden war. People in America have lost freedoms, not because, ISIS has come over the border and attacked us, not because of world wars that have come in and invaded our land and now we're living under a foreign domination, but freedom has been lost with this gradual encroachment whereby we have a government now that is like the government of England that dictates to Americans what they must believe. Well, in this month of freedom, I want us to begin to consider biblically and historically who we are as a people, because America is now at a crossroads. Do we continue losing freedom, or do we stand up for the freedoms our forefathers paid a precious price for us? This is Pastor Don Long. You have a great 4th of July. I look forward to talking to you next week.